Well, we're on to the second half of chapter 34 in Little Women. Here we're reading for the Caribou Public Library, and I'm Miss Erin. Thanks for joining us for our chapter book story time today. And I'm going to go ahead and get started where we left off. If you remember, Jo was having thoughts and beliefs about Frederick Bhaer, her professor friend, that he was not only good but great. Right? This belief strengthened daily. She valued his esteem, she coveted his respect. She wanted to be worthy of his friendship, and just when the wish was sincerest, she came near losing everything. It all grew out of a cocked hat. For one evening, the professor came in and gave Jo her lesson, with a paper soldier cap on his head, which Tina had put there, and he had forgotten to take off. It's evident he doesn't look in his glass before coming down, thought Jo with a smile, as he said, "Good evening," and sat soberly down, quite unconscious of the ludicrous contrast between his subject and his headgear, for he was going to read her The Death of Wallenstein. She said nothing at first, for she liked to hear him laugh, his big hearty laugh, when anything funny happened, so she left him to discover it for himself, and presently forgot all about it. For to hear a German read Schiller is rather an absorbing occupation. After the reading came the lesson, which was a lively one, for Jo was in a gay mood that night, and the cocked hat kept her eyes dancing with merriment. The professor didn't know what to make of her, and stopped at last to ask, with an air of mild surprise that was irresistible, "Miss March, for what do you laugh at your master's face? Have you no respect for me, that you go on so bad?" "How can I be respectful, sir, when you forgot to take your hat off?" said Jo. Lifting his hand to his head, the absent-minded professor gravely felt and removed the little cocked hat, looked at it a minute, and then threw back his head and laughed like a merry bass viol. "Ah, I see him now. It is that imp Tina who makes me a fool with my cap. Well, it is nothing. But, see you, if this lesson goes not well, you too shall wear him." But the lesson did not go at all for a few minutes, because Mr. Bhaer caught sight of a picture on the hat, and, unfolding it, said, with an air of great disgust, "I wish these papers did not come into the house. They are not for children to see, nor young people to read. It is not well, and I have no patience with those who make this harm." Jo glanced at the sheet, and saw a pleasing illustration composed of a lunatic, a corpse, a villain, and a viper. She did not like it, but the impulse that made her turn it over was not of displeasure, but fear, because for a minute she fancied the paper was the volcano. It was not, however, and her panic subsided as she remembered that, even if it had been the one of her own tales in it, there would have been no name to betray her. She had betrayed herself, however, by a look and a blush, for, though an absent man, the professor saw a good deal more than people fancied. He knew that Jo wrote, and had met her down among the newspaper offices more than once, but as she never spoke of it, he asked no questions, in spite of a strong desire to see her work. Now it occurred to him that she was doing what she was ashamed to own, and it troubled him. He did not say to himself, "It is none of my business, I have no right to say anything," as many people would have done. He only remembered that she was young and poor, a girl far away from her mother's love and father's care, and he was moved to help her, with an impulse as quick and natural as that which would prompt him to put out his hand to save a baby from a puddle. All this flashed through his mind in a minute, but not a trace of it appeared on his face, and by the time the paper was returned, and Jo's needle threaded, he was ready to say quite naturally, but very gravely, "Yes, you are right to put it from you. I do not like to think that good young girls should see such things. They are made pleasant to some, but I would more rather give my boys gunpowder than play with this bad trash." "All may not be bad, only silly, you know, and if there is a demand for it, I don't see any harm in supplying it. Many very respectable people make an honest living out of what are called sensation stories," said Jo, scratching gathers so energetically that a row of little slits followed her pen. "There is demand for whiskey, but I think you and I do not care to sell it. If the respectable people knew what harm they did, they would not feel that the living was honest. They have no right to put poison in the sugar plum, and let the small ones eat it. No, they should think a little and sweep mud in the street before they do this thing." Mr. Bhaer spoke warmly and walked to the fire, crumpling the paper in his hands. Jo sat still, looking as if the fire had come to her, for her cheeks burned long after the cocked hat had turned to smoke and gone harmlessly up the chimney. I should like much to send all the rest after him, muttered the professor, coming back with a relieved air. Jo thought what a blaze her pile of papers upstairs would make, and her hard-earned money lay rather heavily on her conscience at that minute. Then she thought, consolingly, to herself, mine are not like that. They're only silly, never bad, so I won't be worried. And taking up her book, she said, with a studious face, Shall we go on, sir? I'll be very good and proper now. I shall hope so, was all he meant. Or was all he said. But he meant more than she imagined, and the grave, kind look that he gave made her feel as if the words "weekly volcano" were printed in large type on her forehead. As soon as she went to her room, she got out the papers and carefully reread every one of her stories. Being a little short-sighted, Mr. Bhaer sometimes used eyeglasses, and Jo had tried them once, smiling to see how they magnified the fine print of her book. Now she seemed to have got on the professor's mental or moral spectacles also, for the faults of these poor stories glared at her dreadfully and filled her with dismay. They are trash, and will soon be worse than trash if I go on, for each is more sensational than the last. I've gone blindly on, hurting myself and other people for the sake of money. I know it's so, for I can't read this stuff in sober earnest without being horribly ashamed of it. But what should I do if they were seen at home, or Mr. Bhaer got a hold of them? Jo turned hot at the bare idea and stuffed the whole bundle into the stove, nearly setting her chimney afire with the blaze. Yes, that's the best place for such inflammable nonsense. I'd better burn the house down, I suppose, than let other people blow themselves up with my gunpowder, she thought, as she watched the demon of the Jura whisk away, a little black cinder with fiery eyes. But when nothing remained of all of her 3 months' work except a heap of ashes and the money in her lap, Jo looked sober as she sat on the floor, wondering what she ought to do about her wages. I think I haven't done much harm yet, and may keep this to pay for my time, she said, after a long meditation, adding impatiently, I almost wish I hadn't any conscience. It's so inconvenient. If I didn't care about doing right and didn't feel uncomfortable when doing wrong, I should get on capitally. I can't help wishing sometimes that Father and Mother hadn't been so particular about such things. Ah, Jo, instead of wishing that, thank God that Father and Mother were particular, and pity from your heart those who have no such guardians to hedge them round with principles, which may seem like prison walls to impatient youth, but which will prove sure foundations to build character upon in womanhood. Jo wrote no more sensational stories, deciding that the money did not pay for her share of the sensation. But, going to the other extreme, as is the way with people of her stamp, she took a course of Mrs. Sherwood, Miss Edgeworth, and Hannah More, and then produced a tale which might have been more properly called an essay or a sermon, so intensely moral was it. She had her doubts about it from the beginning, for her lively fancy and girlish romance felt as ill at ease in the new style as she would have done masquerading in the stiff and cumbrous costume of the last century. She sent this didactic gem to several markets, but found no purchaser, and she was inclined to agree with Mr. Dashwood that morals didn't sell. Then she tried a child's story, which she could easily have disposed of if she had not been mercenary enough to demand filthy lucre for it. The only person who offered enough to make it worthwhile to try juvenile literature was a worthy gentleman who felt it his mission to convert all the world to his particular belief. But much as she liked to write for children, Jo could not consent to depict all her naughty boys as being eaten by bears, or tossed by mad bulls, because they did not go to a particular Sabbath school, nor all the good infants who did go, as rewarded by every kind of bliss, from gilded gingerbread to escorts of angels, when they departed from this life with psalms or sermons on their lisping tongues. So nothing came of these trials, and Jo corked up her inkstand and said in a fit of very wholesome humility, I don't know anything. I'll wait until I do before I try again. And meantime, sweep mud in the street, if I can't do better. That's honest, at least. which decision proved that her second tumble down the beanstalk had done her some good. While these internal revolutions were going on, her external life had been as busy and uneventful as usual, and if she sometimes looked serious or a little sad, no one observed it but Professor Bhaer. He did it so quietly that Jo never knew that he was watching, to see if she would accept the profit by his reproof. But she stood the test, and he was satisfied, for, though no words passed between them, he knew that she had given up writing. Not only did he guess it by the fact that the second finger of her right hand was no longer inky, but she spent her evenings downstairs now, was met no more among newspaper offices, and studied with a dogged patience, which assured him that she was bent on occupying her mind with something useful, if not pleasant. He helped her in many ways, proving himself a true friend, and Jo was happy, for while her pen lay idle, she was learning other lessons besides German, and laying a foundation for the sensation story of her own life. It was a pleasant winter, and a long one, for she did not leave Mrs. Kirk until June. Everyone seemed sorry when the time came. The children were inconsolable, and Mr. Bhaer's hair stuck straight up all over his head, for he always rumpled it wildly when disturbed in mind. Going home, you are happy that you have a home to go in, he said, when she told him, and sat silently pulling his beard in the corner, while she held the little Levy on that last evening. She was going early, so she bade them all goodbye overnight, and when his turn came, she said warmly, "Now, sir, you won't forget to come and see us if you ever travel our way, will you? I'll never forgive you if you do, for I want them all to know my friend." "Do you? Shall I come?" he asked, looking down at her with an eager expression, which she did not see. "Yes, come next month. Laurie graduates then, and you'd enjoy commencement as something new." "That is your best friend of whom you speak?" he said, in an altered tone. "Yes, my boy Teddy. I'm very proud of him, and should like you to see him." Jo looked up then, quite unconscious of anything but her own pleasure at the prospect of showing them to one another. Something in Mr. Bhaer's face suddenly recalled the fact that she might find Laurie more than a best friend, and simply because she particularly wished not to look as if anything was the matter, she involuntarily began to blush, and the more she tried not to, the redder she grew. If it had not been for Tina on her knee, she didn't know what would have become of her. Fortunately, the child was moved to hug her, so she managed to hide her face an instant, hoping the professor did not see it. But he did, and his own changed again from that momentary anxiety to its usual expression, as he said cordially, "I fear I shall not make the time for that, but I wish the friend much success, and you all happiness. God bless you." And with that, he shook hands warmly, shouldered Tina, and went away. But after the boys were abed, he sat long before his fire, with a tired look on his face, and the heimweh, or homesickness, lying heavy on his heart. Once, when he remembered Jo, as she sat with the little child in her lap, and that new softness in her face, he leaned his head on his hands a minute, and then roamed about the room as if in search of something that he could not find. "It is not for me. I must not hope it now," he said to himself with a sigh that was almost a groan. Then, as if reproaching himself for the longing that he could not repress, he went and kissed the two tousled heads upon the pillow, took down his seldom-used meerschaum, and opened his Plato. He did his best, and did it manfully, but I don't think he found that a pair of rampant boys, a pipe, or even the divine Plato were very satisfactory substitutes for wife and child and home. Early as it was, he was at the station next morning to see Jo off, and, thanks to him, she began her solitary journey with the pleasant memory of a familiar face smiling its farewell, a bunch of violets to keep her company, and, best of all, the happy thought, "Well, the winter's gone, and I've written no books, earned no fortune, but I've made a friend worth having, and I'll try to keep him all my life." And that is the end of chapter 34. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.